the only time in history that water was safer than land. Dim the lights. Turn off notifications. Grab something cold to drink, because what you're about to hear will chill you to the core. We're going back 252 million years to the day the world almost died. Welcome to the story of the Great Dying.
Picture the worst breakup you've ever had. The one where your heart felt like it was being ripped from your chest, your apartment looked like a crime scene investigation, and your friends contemplated a wellness check. Now multiply that emotional apocalypse by roughly 1 billion, spread it across the entire planet, and stretch it out over thousands of years. Congratulations! You've barely begun to comprehend the Permian-Triassic extinction event, nature's way of saying, "I'd like to speak to the manager of life on Earth." Welcome to the greatest mass extinction our planet has ever experienced, a time so catastrophic that 252 million years later, we're still finding fossilized evidence of its brutality. Forget your climate anxiety doom-scrolling sessions. This was the real deal. Mother Nature didn't just flip the table. She burned down the restaurant, salted the earth, and left a 1-star review. Today, we're diving into the only time in Earth's history when taking a swim might have been your best survival strategy, despite the fact that 95% of marine species were simultaneously calling it quits. When the land became so toxic, so utterly uninhabitable, that even the hardiest creatures were gasping their last breaths in an atmosphere turned against them, the deep ocean, while still a death trap, offered marginally better odds in this planetary game of survival roulette. This isn't just another tale of dinosaurs having a bad day with an asteroid. No, this is the story of the Great Dying, Earth's closest brush with becoming a lifeless rock hurtling through space. So buckle up, dear viewers. We're about to take a journey to a time when our planet nearly pressed its own reset button, and the few organisms that survived would go on to inherit an empty world, eventually leading to us, the species who'd one day create plastic straws, reality television, and pineapple on pizza. Evolution has a twisted sense of humor, doesn't it? If you like this kind of video, please hit the like button, but only if this video touches you in a way that only deep geological history can. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories from the earliest times, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next apocalyptic adventure. And leave a comment below. Where are you watching from? We have viewers from every corner of the modern-day descendants of Pangaea. Let's see how global we can make this conversation. Picture this. 252 million years ago, while you were busy not existing, Earth was sporting a very different look. Instead of our familiar continental fashion show, all land masses had merged into one supermodel of a supercontinent, Pangaea. This was Earth's "I'm trying to find myself" phase, where everything was clumped together like teenagers at an awkward school dance. Pangaea wasn't just big, it was ridiculously, impractically enormous. Imagine if every country on Earth today decided to move in together without discussing personal boundaries first. The interior regions were so far from any ocean that they made modern-day Nebraska look like a tropical paradise. We're talking extreme continental climate on steroids, scorching summers, freezing winters, and precipitation patterns that would make meteorologists weep into their barometric charts. The oceans, meanwhile, had also merged into a single world-spanning entity called Panthalassa, with a smaller inland sea called the Tethys. It was like having one gigantic swimming pool with a hot tub on the side. This oceanic monopoly meant circulation patterns were totally different from today's, with implications for heat distribution, oxygen levels, and marine life that would soon become catastrophically relevant. But the real geological drama was brewing beneath the surface. In what is now Siberia, because of course it would be Siberia, Earth was developing a severe case of volcanic indigestion. The Siberian Traps, a massive, large igneous province, was about to erupt in what can only be described as the most extreme case of geological heartburn in the planet's history. Let's put this in perspective. The 2010 Eyjafjallajökull eruption in Iceland that grounded European flights and made news anchors everywhere struggle with pronunciation, that released approximately 0.15 cubic kilometers of material. The Siberian traps try over 2 million cubic kilometers. That's enough lava to bury the entire United States under 650 feet of molten rock. Talk about a bad case of earth acne. This wasn't just a volcanic eruption. This was a volcanic marathon that lasted for around 2 million years. Imagine the longest, most drawn-out disaster movie ever made, where the catastrophe just keeps going and going while the audience slowly loses the will to live. That was Earth during the late Permian, a planet-wide disaster film with no commercial breaks and a seriously questionable script. The timing couldn't have been worse. The late Permian world was already experiencing climate fluctuations and dropping sea levels as glaciers at the southern pole of Pangaea were melting. Ecosystems were stressed, but adapting. Then the Siberian traps decided to turn everything up to 11. It was like watching someone recover from food poisoning only to be hit by a bus. Technically two separate problems, but the timing makes it particularly unfair. So what happens when you trigger volcanic eruptions that make Mount St. Helens look like a science fair baking soda volcano? You get the cocktail from hell, literally. First came the carbon dioxide. The Siberian traps belched out CO2 like a fraternity house after all-you-can-eat taco night. We're talking about carbon emissions that would make modern fossil fuel executives blush with envy. Current human CO2 emissions? A measly 35-40 billion tons per year. The Siberian traps? Try 100 trillion tons over its active period. If you're keeping score at home, that's enough to increase atmospheric CO2 concentrations from around 300 parts per million to over 2,000. But wait, there's more. When all that lovely lava decided to flow over the extensive coal beds in the region, it was like throwing gasoline on a fire, if the gasoline was also radioactive and on fire already. This coal combustion released even more CO2, plus sulfur dioxide, methane, and a delightful potpourri of toxic metals and halogen compounds. Earth's atmosphere was transforming into something that would make Venus nod in appreciation. The result? Global warming on a scale that makes our current climate crisis look like a slightly overheated room. Average global temperatures increased by 8,010 degree, 14,018 degree. For comparison, we're currently panicking about 1.5 degrees of warming. This was the thermostat from hell, and somebody had jammed it on Inferno. As temperatures soared, the oceans began to struggle. Surface waters heated up, disrupting circulation patterns and preventing oxygen-rich water from reaching the depths. The result was ocean anoxia, vast dead zones spreading through the world's seas like a slow-motion pandemic. To make matters worse, all that carbon dioxide was being absorbed by the oceans, creating carbonic acid and lowering the pH. Marine creatures with calcium carbonate shells suddenly found themselves in the equivalent of an acid bath. On land, things weren't any better. The spike in CO2 created acid rain that would make industrial-era London seem refreshing. Imagine acid so strong it didn't just kill plants, it eroded the actual soil they grew in. It was Earth's version of salting the fields of Carthage, except this time it was happening everywhere. But the coup de grâce? That came from methane. As ocean temperatures rose, frozen methane hydrates on the seafloor began to melt and release their contents. Methane is roughly 25 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than CO2 over a 100-year period, and this sudden release created a runaway greenhouse effect, the climate equivalent of hitting the nitro boost in a racing game when you're already about to crash. The kicker? The eruptions also pumped halocarbons into the atmosphere, which destroyed the ozone layer. So while everything was either suffocating, burning, or dissolving in acid, the surviving organisms also had to contend with deadly UV radiation. It was like Earth was checking off a cosmic bucket list of ways to kill things. As if that wasn't enough, evidence suggests that asteroid impacts may have occurred around the same time, because apparently, when you're already dealing with volcanic apocalypse, acid rain, greenhouse warming, ocean acidification, anoxia, and ozone depletion. What you really need is a space rock or two for good measure. It was the universe's way of saying, you know what would make this extinction better? More extinction. Before this planetary nightmare unfolded, the Permian world was the setting for a bizarre evolutionary theater that would make James Cameron's Avatar creatures look mundane by comparison. In the seas, the undisputed rulers were the Eurypterids, sea scorpions the size of crocodiles, with claws that could snap through bone and chitin alike. Imagine crossing a lobster with a nightmare, then giving it growth hormones and anger management issues. These armored terrors patrolled the shallow waters, their compound eyes scanning for prey with the calculated patience of serial killers. Accompanying them were ammonites, cephalopods resembling Nautilus, but with evolutionary ambition. Their spiral shells housed creatures related to modern octopi and squid, but with a distinctive difference. They hadn't yet developed the intelligence that makes their descendants so fascinating. Think of them as the trust fund babies of the mollusk world, all the evolutionary advantages, but none of the cognitive benefits that would come later. The reef ecosystems were dominated not by corals as we know them today, but by bizarre creatures called rugose and tabulate corals, now entirely extinct, and by sponges of incredible diversity. These reefs were the underwater equivalent of ancient Rome, complex, thriving metropolises that had stood for millions of years, seemingly indestructible until they very suddenly weren't. But the true kings of the Permian seas were the monstrous predators like Dunkleosteus, armored fish the size of buses with bite forces that could shear through anything unfortunate enough to be caught in their guillotine-like jaws. If James Cameron had included these in Titanic, Leonardo DiCaprio wouldn't have needed to worry about hypothermia. He'd have been lunch long before the ship sank. The shallow waters teemed with trilobites, those iconic horseshoe crab relatives that had survived multiple previous mass extinctions with the tenacity of cockroaches. After 300 million years on Earth, they probably thought they were invincible. Spoiler alert, they weren't. The Permian extinction was the trilobite equivalent of finding out your health insurance doesn't cover apocalypses. On land, the situation was equally bizarre and fascinating. The dominant vertebrates weren't dinosaurs, mammals, or even reptiles as we understand them today. Instead, the world was ruled by synapsids, the ancestors of mammals who hadn't quite gotten the evolutionary memo about what mammals should look like. The apex predator was Gorgonops, a saber-toothed nightmare that combined the worst aspects of reptiles and mammals into one terrifying package. Picture a tiger's body with a crocodile's head, topped off with teeth that would make a T. Rex say, "That's a bit excessive, don't you think?" These creatures hunted across the Pangaean landscape, their mammal-like metabolism giving them advantages over their prey that modern reptiles could only dream of. Their preferred lunch? Probably creatures like Dicynodon, bizarre tusked herbivores that looked like someone had asked a child to draw a pig, a turtle, and a bird from memory, then combined all three drawings into one animal. These beaked herbivores had the unfortunate evolutionary strategy of being slow, relatively defenseless, and nutritious, the Permian equivalent of a walking buffet. The forests themselves would be utterly alien to modern eyes. No flowering plants, no grasses, not even proper conifers as we know them. Instead, the landscape was dominated by lycopsids, giant club mosses that stretched toward the sky like organic skyscrapers, their scaled trunks topped with spore-producing structures that looked like something from a sci-fi film. Alongside them grew the glossopterids, seed ferns that spread across the southern parts of Pangaea in vast forests. These weren't the delicate ferns of your houseplant collection. These were tough, woody trees that had mastered the art of reproduction through seeds long before flowering plants showed up to steal their thunder. Scuttling through the undergrowth were millipedes the size of pythons and dragonflies with wingspans like eagles. The insect world was experiencing its own golden age of gigantism thanks to higher oxygen levels that allowed their primitive respiratory systems to support larger bodies. These weren't bugs, they were nope on an evolutionary scale. As the extinction began, these creatures faced challenges unlike anything evolution had prepared them for. The synapsids, with their higher metabolic rates, required more oxygen, exactly what was becoming scarce as the atmosphere filled with carbon dioxide. Imagine running a marathon while someone slowly replaces the air with car exhaust. That was life for the most advanced creatures on land. Marine species faced their own nightmares. As the oceans acidified, anything with a calcium carbonate shell found itself essentially dissolving. Imagine if your bones started to soften and warp while you were still using them. The ammonites, brachiopods, and countless other shelled creatures experienced the evolutionary equivalent of having their houses melt around them while they were still inside. For reef builders, the combination of warming waters, acidification, and anoxia was a perfect storm. Reef ecosystems collapsed with astonishing speed, not over millions of years, but possibly within thousands or even hundreds. These underwater cities, which had taken millions of years to build, vanished like sandcastles at high tide. Even the hardy insects, which had survived everything Earth had thrown at them for hundreds of millions of years, found themselves in an environment so toxic that many species simply couldn't adapt fast enough. When even the cockroach's ancestors are struggling, you know the planet is having a really, really bad day. What followed was not just an extinction, it was Earth's closest brush with sterilization. Over 90% of all marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species disappeared in what paleontologists tactfully call an extinction event, as if the deaths of trillions of organisms across every continent and ocean was some sort of cocktail party that went sideways. In the oceans, the apocalypse was nearly complete. Entire classes of animals, groups that had dominated for hundreds of millions of years, simply ceased to exist. The trilobites, after surviving multiple previous mass extinctions with cockroach-like tenacity, finally met their match. They had endured for over 300 million years, longer than dinosaurs existed and far longer than primates have been around, only to be completely wiped out. It was the evolutionary equivalent of deleting your game save file after hundreds of hours of gameplay. The productive reef ecosystems, the rainforests of the Permian seas, collapsed entirely. The rugose and tabulate corals that had built massive underwater structures for millions of years disappeared without descendants. Their evolutionary lineages cut short like TV shows canceled after a successful run. The underwater cities they created, teeming with life and complexity, vanished, leaving behind barren seafloors that would remain largely empty for millions of years. Ammonites were hit so hard that only a single genus survived, the equivalent of an entire country being reduced to one small family. This lucky lineage would eventually repopulate the oceans with their descendants, but the road back would be long and precarious. Imagine if all of human civilization was reduced to one small village, and you'll get some sense of the scale of loss. Even the eurypterids, the terrifying sea scorpions that had been the unchallenged predators of the seas, disappeared completely. These armored nightmares, some large enough to hunt fish the size of modern sharks, proved no match for an ocean turning to acid and depleted of oxygen. Being the apex predator means nothing when your entire ecosystem collapses beneath you. On land, the devastation was equally profound. The glossopterid forests that had dominated the southern hemisphere for millions of years disappeared so completely that their extinction marks a clear boundary in the fossil record, like a geological before and after photo that paleontologists can identify instantly in rock strata worldwide. The synapsids, our own distant ancestors, were decimated. Groups like the gorgonopsids, which had evolved into some of the most efficient predators the world had yet seen, vanished entirely. The dicynodonts, which had spread across Pangaea in vast herds, were reduced to a handful of species. It was as if evolution had been working on a complex painting for millions of years, only to have someone throw acid on the canvas and destroy most of the work. Even the insects, the ultimate survivors of Earth's biosphere, suffered unprecedented losses. When the creatures that can survive nuclear radiation and eat practically anything are dying en masse, you know the situation is dire beyond comprehension. But perhaps the most telling evidence of the extinction's severity comes from the fossil record itself, or rather, the lack thereof. After the boundary between the Permian and Triassic periods, there's a bizarre feature in the rock layers that paleontologists call the coal gap. For roughly 10 million years after the extinction, no coal deposits formed anywhere on Earth. None. Zero. This wasn't because conditions weren't right for coal formation. It was because there weren't enough plants growing and dying to create coal. The terrestrial biosphere had been so thoroughly devastated that one of Earth's most common sedimentary processes simply stopped. The marine fossil record tells a similar story of emptiness. After the rich diversity of Permian seas, with their countless species and complex ecological relationships, the early Triassic oceans were biological deserts. The fossils that do appear are dominated by disaster taxa, opportunistic organisms that thrive in disturbed environments, the ecological equivalent of weeds growing in a bombed-out city. Perhaps most disturbing is a phenomenon paleontologists call the Lilliput effect, where the surviving species became dramatically smaller after the extinction. Imagine if every animal on Earth suddenly shrank to half its normal size due to environmental stress. That's essentially what happened in the aftermath of the Great Dying. It was evolution in reverse, creatures becoming simpler, smaller, and less specialized just to survive at all. And survive they did, barely. If the history of life on Earth were a movie, the Permian extinction would be that moment where the protagonist is hanging from a cliff by their fingertips, seconds from falling to their death. Life on Earth came that close to ending altogether. So what saved life on Earth from complete annihilation? The answer might disappoint those hoping for a dramatic, last-minute rescue. Nothing but time and the sheer stubborn persistence of life itself. The Siberian traps eventually stopped erupting. The greenhouse gases, while persistent, eventually dissipated or were absorbed. The planet, wounded but not destroyed, began the slow process of healing. But make no mistake, recovery was agonizingly slow. While most mass extinctions see ecosystems bounce back within 1 million years or so, a mere blink in geological time, the aftermath of the Permian extinction remained a biological wasteland for 5 to 10 million years. For context, that's about twice as long as humans have existed as a species. It's as if Earth's biosphere had to be rebuilt almost from scratch. The survivors of this planetary catastrophe inherited an empty world, a biological frontier with vacated niches and opportunities in every direction. And who were these lucky few? In the seas, a handful of ammonite species eventually gave rise to new lineages that would thrive until the dinosaur-killing asteroid some 186 million years later. Small, burrowing creatures that could survive in low oxygen conditions found themselves the unexpected inheritors of once crowded seafloors. On land, the few remaining synapsids, including our own distant ancestors, were joined by an obscure group of reptiles that would soon diversify into incredible new forms. These archosaurs, having squeaked through the extinction by the narrowest of margins, would eventually give rise to crocodilians, pterosaurs, and yes, the dinosaurs themselves. Life was re-rolling the evolutionary dice, and the results would reshape the planet. The ultimate irony? This catastrophe that nearly sterilized the planet is the reason you exist at all. Had the Great Dying never occurred, dinosaurs might never have risen to dominance. Without dinosaur dominance, mammals might never have evolved their adaptability and intelligence while hiding in the shadows. Without those adaptations, primates might never have evolved. Without primates, well, you get the picture. You owe your morning coffee and existential dread to the worst day in Earth's history. Today, as we face our own climate crisis, the Permian extinction offers both warnings and strange comfort. The warning is clear. Altering atmospheric chemistry can have consequences far beyond our predictions or control. The Earth system, while robust in many ways, has tipping points beyond which recovery becomes uncertain and painfully slow. The comfort, perversely, comes from the knowledge that even after the worst imaginable planetary catastrophe, life persisted, not unchanged, not undiminished, but it continued. Earth has experienced climate change that makes our current situation look like a minor temperature fluctuation, and while the biosphere was devastated, it eventually recovered. Of course, that recovery took millions of years. Cold comfort for a species that gets impatient waiting for a pizza delivery. The lesson of the Great Dying isn't that Earth will be fine. It's that the consequences of rapid environmental change can last far longer than the civilizations that trigger them. So the next time someone tells you to save the planet, remember, the planet will be fine, eventually. It survived worse than us. What we're really trying to save is ourselves and the millions of species with whom we share this resilient, scarred, beautiful world. Earth has reset itself before, and it can do so again. The question is whether we want to be around to see what comes next. Because if there's one lesson the Permian extinction teaches us definitively, it's that being a dominant, well-established species offers no protection when the rules of survival suddenly change. Just ask the trilobites, if you can find one. Ever wonder what it feels like to rule the world for 165 million years only to have your retirement plans obliterated by a space rock with terrible timing? Just ask the dinosaurs. Oh wait, you can't. They're all dead. Welcome to Earth's greatest story of success and spectacular failure. A tale where being the biggest, baddest, most evolutionary successful experiment on the planet means absolutely nothing when the cosmos decides to play cosmic billiards with your address. For over 1.5 football seasons of geological time, that's 165 million years for those keeping score, dinosaurs ran the terrestrial game show of life. They didn't just participate, they dominated every category, claimed every prize, and left the competition hiding in burrows, wondering if they'd ever get a turn. These magnificent beasts evolved from humble beginnings in the Triassic to become the undisputed heavyweight champions of the Mesozoic. They diversified into forms that defy imagination, from bone-crushing behemoths that made today's apex predators look like anxious chihuahuas to feathered marvels that would make even the most flamboyant peacock reconsider its fashion choices. They colonized every continent, mastered every terrestrial niche, and established dynasties that outlasted any human empire by factors that make our civilization look like a historical footnote written in disappearing ink. But here's where the cosmic joke gets especially dark. While T. Rex was busy terrorizing the Cretaceous countryside, and Triceratops was evolving the perfect defensive headgear, tiny mammals, our ancestors, were scurrying around like neurotic night shift workers, keeping their heads down and trying not to become dinosaur appetizers. These furry little nobodies, these evolutionary afterthoughts, were the ultimate underdogs in a game rigged entirely against them. Then came the universe's most dramatic plot twist. Imagine being at the absolute peak of your evolutionary game, having fine-tuned your hunting strategies, perfected your reproductive tactics, and established yourself as the ultimate biological success story, only to have a 6-mile-wide asteroid slam into the planet at 45,000 miles per hour with the explosive force of 10 billion Hiroshima bombs. That's not just bad luck. That's the universe saying, "Nice dinosaur civilization you got there. Would be a shame if something happened to it." And happened it did. In evolutionary terms, the asteroid hit with the subtlety of a drunk wedding guest giving an unplanned toast. One moment, dinosaurs were living their best Cretaceous lives. The next, they were facing an apocalypse of biblical proportions: fire, darkness, acid rain, nuclear winter, and ecological collapse served as a cosmic all-you-can-endure buffet of extinction. When the dust literally settled, our tiny ancestors emerged from their burrows, blinked in the toxic sunlight, and found themselves inheriting a vacant Earth. Talk about falling upward into success. These mammals, previously restricted to nocturnal scavenging and bug eating, suddenly had an entire planet's worth of ecological niches to explore. From these humble beginnings arose the lineages that would eventually produce everything from blue whales to bats, elephants to humans. So as we dig up their bones and place them in museums, remember, dinosaurs won the first round of Earth's great game, and for a very long time. But they never saw the cosmic sucker punch coming. Meanwhile, those insignificant little furballs, they were just biding their time, unknowingly preparing for their moment. After all, in evolution, as in comedy, timing is everything. Picture Earth, 66 million years ago. Not the blue marble we know today, but a hot, sweaty greenhouse of a planet that would make climate change deniers break into a cold sweat. Average temperatures? About 10 degrees C warmer than today's climate-less pleasant spring day, and more, forgot your sunscreen in Death Valley. The supercontinent Pangaea had long since fractured like a dropped dinner plate, with its pieces drifting into configurations almost recognizable to our modern eyes. North America and Eurasia were playing a geological game of tag. South America was an island continent with a unique evolutionary laboratory of weird creatures. Africa was heading north for a slow-motion collision with Europe that would eventually create the Mediterranean's vacation hotspots. India was speed racing northward to crash into Asia and create the Himalayas. Australia and Antarctica were still joined at the hip, enjoying the last moments of their continental friendship before drifting apart. Sea levels? Imagine coastal real estate with a very limited shelf life. Waters stood 100-200 meters higher than today, creating vast inland seas where suburban shopping malls and wheat fields now stand. Kansas wasn't growing corn, it was growing coral. North America was split by a massive seaway stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic, effectively creating two separate continents with two separate evolutionary stories. The climate was in hothouse Earth mode. No polar ice caps existed to reflect sunlight back into space or regulate ocean currents. Temperate forests stretched to the poles. Palm trees grew in Antarctica. Crocodiles swam in Arctic waters. Seasonal changes existed but were mere suggestions rather than the dramatic production numbers they are today in higher latitudes. Carbon dioxide levels were 5 times higher than our pre-industrial standards, creating a greenhouse effect that would make modern climate scientists update their apocalyptic PowerPoint presentations. Oxygen levels were similarly elevated, supercharging the atmosphere and allowing insects to grow to nightmare proportions. Think dragonflies with 2-foot wingspans, millipedes the size of small cars, and cockroaches that wouldn't just survive a nuclear war, but probably negotiate the peace treaty afterward. The oceans were similarly alien. Massive marine reptiles like mosasaurs and plesiosaurs ruled the waves instead of whales and dolphins. Ammonites, coiled relatives of today's octopuses and squids, drifted in enormous numbers. Coral reefs were architectural marvels built by different players than today's reef builders. Sharks were already 350 million years into their evolutionary success story, having long perfected the art of not fixing what isn't broken. Volcanic activity was writing Earth's autobiography in molten chapters. The Deccan Traps in India were in full eruptive mode, spewing enough lava to cover half of modern India in flows up to 2 kilometers thick. These massive eruptions were already stressing global ecosystems, injecting sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, acidifying oceans, and giving dinosaurs environmental headaches long before the asteroid decided to crash the party. Forests looked both familiar and alien. Flowering plants had only recently evolved, but were already revolutionizing terrestrial ecosystems, like aggressive tech startups disrupting established markets. Conifers, ginkgos, cycads, and tree ferns created canopies that hadn't yet conceived of deciduous seasonal strategies. The understory was a mix of ferns, horsetails, and primitive flowering plants, a botanical time capsule from when plants were still experimenting with reproductive technologies. This was the stage-hot, humid, volcanically active, and dramatically different from our world upon which the final act of dinosaur dominance would play out. And what a stage it was. Perfect for dinosaurs, precarious for mammals, and completely unprepared for what was coming. For dinosaurs, the late Cretaceous was the evolutionary equivalent of being at the height of your career, with a corner office, stock options, and your name on the reserved parking spot right before the company files for unexpected bankruptcy. They weren't just successful, they were the definition of biological success itself. After 165 million years of evolutionary refinement, a time span that makes human civilization look like a TikTok video, dinosaurs had conquered every terrestrial niche worth having. Apex predators like Tyrannosaurus rex had perfected the business model of terrifying everything else into submission. Titanosaurs had cornered the market on being so absurdly massive that predation became a problem for smaller creatures. Hadrosaurs and ceratopsians had diversified into hundreds of species, creating evolutionary franchises across the northern continents. Troodontids had achieved near mammalian levels of brain-to-body ratios, suggesting the unsettling possibility that, given a few more million years, we might be watching documentaries made by sentient dinosaur descendants. Their supremacy seemed ironclad, written in biological stone. What could possibly threaten creatures that had survived multiple extinction events, adapted to continental breakups, and weathered climate fluctuations that would send modern ecosystems into panic mode? When you've been evolutionary royalty for 1,650 centuries, complacency isn't just tempting, it's practically mandatory. Yet beneath this apparent security lurked catastrophic vulnerability. For all their specialized greatness, dinosaurs had unknowingly painted themselves into an evolutionary corner. The very adaptations that made them supreme in the Mesozoic large bodies requiring vast food resources, specialized diets, long maturation periods, complex social structures created single points of failure in their biological business model. They had optimized for a world that was about to be violently rebooted. Meanwhile, mammals, those pathetic little nocturnal furballs, were inadvertently preparing for apocalypse. Small bodies requiring minimal resources? Check. Omnivorous diets allowing dietary flexibility? Check. Rapid reproduction cycles? Check. Ability to enter torpor during resource scarcity? Check. Burrowing behaviors that might shield them from environmental catastrophe? Check and mate. The dinosaurs' seeming safety was like building a magnificent castle without noticing the volcano rumbling behind it. They were perfectly adapted for business as usual, but the universe rarely sends advance warning when it decides to change the rules. And those rules were about to change drastically. The Deccan traps were already belching climate-altering volumes of gas and ash into the atmosphere. Imagine dealing with the volcanic equivalent of 1,000 Krakatoas while trying to maintain your evolutionary empire. Some dinosaur populations were likely already under stress, their ecosystems strained by volcanic winter, acid rain, and habitat disruption. But volcanism was merely the opening act for extinction's main event. The cosmic lottery of asteroid impacts, a game of Russian roulette played across geological time, was about to hit the dinosaur jackpot. The Earth orbits the Sun in a cosmic shooting gallery of asteroids and comets, most of which miss our planetary target. For 165 million years, dinosaurs had benefited from astronomical good luck, with no major impacts during their reign. Their luck was about to run catastrophically out. The final moments of the Cretaceous represented the ultimate contrast between apparent safety and imminent danger, like texting while crossing a busy intersection. Dinosaurs, secure in their evolutionary superiority, had no concept that their dominance was about to face an extinction-level stress test. They couldn't have evolved to anticipate or survive what was coming, so they continued their Cretaceous lives hunting, mating, nesting, evolving, blissfully unaware that in astronomical terms, the cosmic guillotine was already falling. Their story was about to become the greatest cautionary tale in evolutionary history. Even 165 million years of success provides no guarantees against the universe's capacity for random destruction. Tyrannosaurus rex biology's answer to the question, what if anxiety had teeth and anger issues, Picture 9 tons of muscular nightmare with a bite force strong enough to crush a car. Those comically small arms? Not a design flaw, but an evolutionary shrug that said, with a head this terrifying, who needs functional hands? T-Rex's brain-to-body ratio suggested intelligence comparable to modern birds, meaning it wasn't just hunting you, it was outsmarting you while calculating the optimal way to separate your torso from your aspirations. Its keen sense of smell could detect carrion from miles away, the Cretaceous equivalent of ordering delivery when cooking seems like too much effort. Triceratops. The SUV of dinosaurs rumbled across the landscape with the subtlety of a rhinoceros at a China convention. Sporting a skull that was 1/3 of its body length and adorned with horns that would make a Texas cattle rancher weep with envy, these herbivores were what happened when evolution decided that defensive driving should be taken literally. That distinctive frill? Part radiator, part status symbol, part don't even think about it, warning to predators. When a 7-ton vegetarian evolves to look like it wants to speak to the manager of natural selection, even T, Rex would consider easier dining options. Ankylosaurus walking tank, evolutionary pessimist, living proof that sometimes the best offense is making yourself completely inedible. Imagine a dinosaur so thoroughly done with being prey that it transformed itself into a knobby, armored potato with a built-in sledgehammer. Its body was covered in osteoderm's bony plates embedded in the skin, arranged with the architectural precision of someone who's been mugged too many times. The tail club could shatter the leg bones of even the most persistent predator, delivering the Cretaceous equivalent of "I said no" with devastating finality. Meanwhile, in the skies, Quetzalcoatlus northropi demonstrated what happens when evolution gets carried away with itself. With a wingspan of up to 36 feet, roughly the width of a tennis court, these pterosaurs were less flying reptile and more biological aircraft. Standing as tall as a giraffe when grounded, they could launch themselves into the air like demonic umbrellas, soaring across continents and potentially staying aloft for days. Their long spear-like beaks were perfect for fishing, hunting small prey, or potentially impaling the dreams of anything that annoyed them. Beneath the waves, mosasaurs combined the worst features of crocodiles, sharks, and divorce lawyers. These marine reptiles grew up to 50 feet long and possessed double-hinged jaws for swallowing prey whole, presumably while making direct eye contact to establish dominance. Their paddle-like limbs propelled them through ancient oceans with the grace of aquatic freight trains, while their teeth curved backward to ensure that anything entering their maw was embarking on a one-way journey. And what of our ancestors, those fuzzy footnotes scurrying through this age of reptilian grandeur? Meet Purgatorius, a shrew-like mammal approximately the size of your thumb, while T. Rex was redefining terror one footstep at a time. This unimpressive ball of fur was foraging for insects, seeds, and fruit during the safety of night. With eyes adapted for low light and a brain devoted largely to smell and hearing, it lived in a sensory world dominated by the terror of being detected. Its strategy? Be small, be quick, be nocturnal, be forgettable. In the high-stakes evolutionary game of the late Cretaceous, Purgatorius and its mammalian kin were playing not to win, but merely to avoid losing catastrophically. Yet sometimes history favors those who simply manage not to die, rather than those who seem most likely to succeed, and the universe was about to demonstrate this principle with devastating clarity. It began as a point of light in the Cretaceous sky, an astronomical footnote, a cosmic afterthought, a traveler that had wandered the solar system for millions of years before chance and gravity conspired to send it on a collision course with the third planet from the sun. This rock, this stupid, mindless, unthinking chunk of space debris, approximately 6 miles wide, was about to rewrite Earth's evolutionary script with the subtlety of a sledgehammer performing neurosurgery. The asteroid screamed through Earth's atmosphere at 45,000 miles per hour, superheating the air into plasma and announcing its arrival with a flash brighter than 1,000 suns. For any dinosaur unfortunate enough to be looking up, this brief moment of confused observation was their last. The asteroid struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula with a force exceeding 10 billion Hiroshima bombs, releasing more energy in a few seconds than all the nuclear weapons ever created could manage if detonated simultaneously. The impact didn't just create a crater, it vaporized rock, sending it into suborbital trajectories and effectively turning geology into artillery. The crater, 100 miles wide and 12 miles deep, wasn't so much a hole as it was the planet's new trauma response. Tsunamis hundreds of feet high raced outward, drowning coastlines around the Gulf of Mexico and surging miles inland. Earthquake waves rippled through the planet's crust, triggering volcanic eruptions and landslides thousands of miles from ground zero. But this was merely the opening act of Extinction's symphony. The true kill mechanism arrived in multiple overlapping waves of planetary destruction. First came the thermal pulse, a flash of heat radiating from the impact site and from superheated debris raining back through the atmosphere. Forests ignited. Exposed animals cooked where they stood. Global wildfires erupted simultaneously, converting vast swaths of the planet's vegetation into smoke and ash. Next came darkness. The impact ejected billions of tons of dust, soot, and sulfur into the atmosphere, creating a light-blocking shroud that encircled the planet. Photosynthesis crashed to a halt. The base of the food chain collapsed. Temperatures plummeted in what scientists call impact winter, a sudden, severe global cooling that persisted for years. Imagine a nuclear winter without the courtesy of a declaration of war. Rain turned acidic as sulfur compounds combined with atmospheric moisture, burning plant tissues and poisoning freshwater systems. Marine ecosystems suffered devastating acidification as carbon dioxide levels spiked, dissolving the shells of countless organisms and collapsing oceanic food webs from the bottom up. For the dinosaurs that survived the initial catastrophe, those lucky enough to be sheltered from the thermal pulse, far from tsunamis, and somehow able to find food, the following months brought slow starvation in a darkened, freezing world devoid of plant life. Herbivores died first, their specialized digestive systems unable to process what little vegetation remained. Carnivores followed, their prey base extinguished. Scavengers enjoyed a brief golden age of abundance before joining the extinction ledger themselves. The evolutionary experiment that had dominated Earth for 165 million years ended not with a whimper, but with a planet-shaking bang. An estimated 75% of all species vanished, erased from existence by cosmic chance. The extinction wasn't democratic, it was brutally selective. Large-bodied land animals requiring substantial food resources? Extinct. Specialized feeders dependent on specific plant species? Extinct. Animals unable to shelter effectively or survive on minimal resources? Extinct. As the dust literally settled, the few survivors emerged into a transformed world, a reset Earth where the rules of evolutionary success had been rewritten overnight. The planet that had been dinosaur paradise was now their tomb, and the stage was set for evolution's next great experiment, the age of mammals. Fast forward 66 million years. The descendants of those insignificant little furballs, the ones who survived by being too small and unimportant to notice, now run the planet with all the humility of lottery winners at a car dealership. We've named the asteroid Chicxulub, calculated its trajectory, and even located its cosmic crime scene. We dig up dinosaur bones, reconstruct their appearances, and sell plastic versions to our children as toys. The ultimate evolutionary insult, your species becomes another species' plaything. We mammals have spent our 66 million years of unexpected opportunity building our own version of planetary dominance. We've spawned everything from blue whales to bumblebee bats, from elephants to embryonic humans scrolling through their phones while ignoring actual human interaction. We've conquered every habitat, developed opposable thumbs and oversized brains, invented social media and nuclear weapons, and generally behaved like we own the place, which, to be fair, we technically do. But here's the cosmic punchline that should keep us awake at night. We're making all the same mistakes the dinosaurs made, minus the excuse of having brains the size of walnuts. We've become the planet's dominant species. We've altered environments to suit our needs. We've spread across continents, exploited resources, and generally acted like evolution's chosen ones. Sound familiar? It should. The dinosaurs wrote this playbook. We're just adding thumbs and TikTok to the equation. The universe hasn't suddenly developed a sense of mercy or fairness in the last 66 million years. Asteroids still cruise through our cosmic neighborhood. Supervolcanoes still slumber beneath picturesque national parks. Climate systems still possess tipping points we're enthusiastically racing toward. The cosmic lottery of extinction events doesn't care about your stock portfolio, your social media following, or humanity's collective belief in its own exceptional status. Just ask the dinosaurs. Oh, wait, you can't. They're all dead, and they didn't even see it coming. At least we've spotted the threats. We track near-Earth objects, monitor volcanic activity, and create increasingly alarming climate models. We've developed the intelligence to see extinction possibilities approaching, which makes our reluctance to address them all the more darkly ironic. The dinosaurs can be forgiven for not developing space programs or climate action plans. We cannot claim the same excuse. So, what's the lesson in this 66 million-year-old cautionary tale? Perhaps it's that dominance doesn't equal invulnerability. Perhaps it's that evolution rewards not the strongest or most established, but those best able to adapt to sudden, catastrophic change. Perhaps it's simply that the universe occasionally likes to hit the reset button on planetary life experiments, and no amount of evolutionary success provides immunity from cosmic bad luck. Or perhaps the real irony is this. We're the only species in Earth's history with the capacity to prevent our own extinction, and yet we seem determined to engineer it ourselves through environmental destruction, resource depletion, and weaponized technology. The dinosaurs needed an asteroid. We might manage it all on our own. So, as you contemplate your place in Earth's grand evolutionary narrative, remember, you exist because a cosmic rock happened to hit the planet at precisely the right time to wipe out the previous tenants, creating the vacancy that mammals eventually filled. Your entire existence is the product of astronomical chance and evolutionary opportunity, and somewhere in the vast emptiness of space, another asteroid might be slowly altering its orbit, beginning the long journey that ends with Earth in its crosshairs. The universe's dark sense of humor remains intact, ready to deliver the next punchline. No pressure, mammals. The clock is ticking. Imagine being so evolutionarily significant that you're practically the reptile equivalent of inventing the wheel, yet so obscure that even most paleontology nerds would struggle to pick you out of a fossil lineup. Welcome to the life of Limnoceles, the forgotten grandfather of terrestrial domination. While Rex gets Hollywood movies and Velociraptor gets the fan clubs, Limnoceles sits in the evolutionary green room, nursing its prehistoric drink and muttering, "Without me, none of those flashy dinosaurs would even exist." Let's be honest. When you picture prehistoric creatures, you conjure images of massive dinosaurs crushing forests underfoot or saber-toothed cats terrorizing early humans. You don't picture a meter-long lizard-like creature with an identity crisis, trapped between being an amphibian and a proper reptile. Limnoceles didn't get the evolutionary memo about specializing, instead opting for the jack-of-all-trades, master-of-none approach that would eventually lead to one of Earth's greatest success stories. Living around 300 million years ago, this creature emerged during a time when life was still figuring out how to fully conquer land. Fish had barely dragged themselves onto shore, amphibians were still tethered to water for reproduction, and true terrestrial dominance remained an unclaimed evolutionary prize. Enter Limnoceles. Not particularly impressive, not especially terrifying, but holding the genetic blueprints that would eventually produce everything from velociraptors to eagles. If evolution were a tech company, Limnocoelus would be that unsung engineer who developed a foundational piece of code that every future product would use, yet never got invited to the glamorous product launches. While later reptiles and dinosaurs would refine and optimize this evolutionary software into spectacular variations, our humble protagonist was doing the unglamorous work of solving basic terrestrial problems: how to move efficiently on land, how to not instantly dry out, and most importantly, how to tell water, "It's not you, it's me. I need some space." The evolutionary achievement of Limnocoelus and its contemporaries was revolutionary, the full transition to life on land. This wasn't just moving a few feet up the beach. This was declaring independence from the aquatic realm that had nurtured vertebrate life for millions of years. It was the biological equivalent of moving out of your parents' basement, getting your own apartment, and figuring out how to survive without someone constantly refilling the refrigerator. What makes Limnocoelus particularly fascinating isn't just what it was, but what it represents: the awkward teenage years of terrestrial vertebrate evolution. Not quite an amphibian, not fully a reptile, it existed in that transitional space where nature was actively experimenting with new designs. It's easy to marvel at the polished end products like dinosaurs and birds, but the real magic of evolution happens in these transitional forms where you can almost see nature sketching out ideas in real time. So why should you care about this obscure creature from 300 million years ago? Because without Limnocoelus and its relatives taking those first evolutionary steps, the entire history of land vertebrates might have played out differently. No dinosaurs ruling the Mesozoic, no birds filling the skies, no mammals emerging to eventually produce primates and humans. The entire glorious parade of terrestrial vertebrate evolution traces back to these humble beginnings, to creatures like Limnocoelus that dared to solve the fundamental challenges of land living. In the grand evolutionary narrative, Limnocoelus may be just a footnote, but it's the kind of footnote that, when followed, reveals an entire untold story of how life as we know it came to be. If nature held a costume party during the late Carboniferous period, Limnocoelus would have shown up wearing parts from at least 3 different outfits. Picture a creature assembled by an evolutionary committee that couldn't quite agree on what they were designing. "More amphibian," shouts one member. "No, more reptile," counters another. "Why not both?" suggests the third, clearly the compromise candidate. Stretching about 1.5 meters from snout to tail, roughly the size of a Komodo dragon's awkward cousin Limnocoelus, sported a body that screamed "work in progress." Its robust skull, disproportionately large compared to its body, housed a brain that was likely contemplating life's great question: am I an amphibian with reptile aspirations, or a reptile with amphibian baggage? The skull itself deserves special attention, a solid, airtight construction resembling a crocodilian's head that took a wrong turn at evolution junction. With strong jaw muscles and a row of uniform conical teeth, Limnocoelus wasn't winning any dental beauty contests, but it wasn't trying to. These teeth weren't specialized for specific diets. They were the prehistoric equivalent of all-purpose kitchen utensils, good enough for most jobs, excellent at none. Its limbs tell the most interesting story of evolutionary transition. Unlike the sprawling, belly-dragging posture of typical amphibians, Limnocoelus had limbs that extended more downward than outward, allowing it to hold its body higher off the ground. Imagine a salamander hitting the gym for 6 months and suddenly developing actual biceps and the ability to do push-ups. The front limbs were particularly powerful, built for digging or pushing through underbrush, with 5 fingers that hadn't yet received the memo about digit reduction that later reptiles would embrace. The spine of Limnocoelus reveals another evolutionary plot twist. While most amphibians have vertebrae that are simple in structure, our transitional hero had more complex vertebrae with additional processes and articulations that provided better support for its body on land. It's as if nature looked at the basic amphibian spine and said, "Let's add some structural reinforcement here. This model's going terrestrial." Perhaps most tellingly, Limnocoelus possessed a stronger pelvic girdle than its purely amphibian contemporaries. This reinforced hip structure better connected the powerful hind limbs to the spine, improving terrestrial locomotion. In the evolutionary arms race to conquer land, having hips that didn't dislocate when you tried to run was a significant advantage. The skin of Limnocoelus, though not preserved in fossils, was likely less permeable than that of typical amphibians, but not yet as watertight as later reptiles. Picture the dermatological equivalent of water-resistant, but not waterproof, hiking gear good enough for brief excursions away from water, but not ready for desert living. What truly set Limnocoelus apart was its ribcage expanded and more barrel-like compared to amphibians, providing better protection for internal organs and possibly supporting more efficient lungs. While typical amphibians breathe partly through their skin and rely on buccal pumping, essentially gulping air, Limnocoelus was likely developing more efficient respiratory mechanisms, though still a far cry from the sophisticated lung structures of later amniotes. The tail, moderately long and likely somewhat flattened, served as both a counterbalance for terrestrial movement and possibly an aid for swimming. It's the evolutionary equivalent of hedging your bets. I'm committed to this land thing, but let's keep the aquatic backup plan just in case. If you were to encounter Limnocoelus in its prime, you'd see an animal that moved with purpose, but not grace, a creature caught between two worlds, carrying the genetic blueprints for a terrestrial revolution while still bearing the marks of its aquatic ancestry. Not beautiful by conventional standards, but magnificent in what it represented. Life finding a way to solve the challenges of a new frontier. When Limnocoelus was roaming Earth during the late Carboniferous and early Permian periods, roughly 310-270 million years ago, our planet was having what can only be described as an extreme makeover continental edition. Imagine Earth's version of moving furniture around, except the furniture weighs billions of tons and creates mountain ranges when it collides. The supercontinent Pangaea was in its formative phase, with the landmasses crashing together like drunk guests at a planetary house party. The climate? Think global sauna, but with bizarre seasonal mood swings. Average temperatures were significantly higher than today, with no polar ice caps giving the planet its current air conditioning system. Carbon dioxide levels would make modern climate scientists hyperventilate potentially 5 times higher than pre-industrial levels. This greenhouse Earth created conditions where both insects and plants decided that normal size was for quitters. Speaking of plants, forget grass, flowers, or any of the vegetation you're familiar with. They didn't exist yet. Instead, Limnocoelus navigated through a world dominated by massive primitive forests, the famous coal swamps that would eventually power the Industrial Revolution. Giant lycopsids, think club mosses on steroids, grew up to 40 meters tall, creating prehistoric skyscrapers. Horsetails reached the height of modern trees, while true ferns carpeted the understory. It was like wandering through a Dr. Seuss illustration, but with more swamps and fewer rhyming creatures. These coal swamps were the ecological equivalent of prime real estate, warm, humid environments teeming with arthropods and other small creatures that made excellent snacks for our Limnocoelus. The abundance of standing water created a patchwork landscape of pools, lakes, and waterways interrupting the dense vegetation ideal for an animal that hadn't fully committed to the terrestrial lifestyle. Oxygen levels during this period deserve special mention because they were, quite frankly, ridiculous. Atmospheric oxygen reached upwards of 35%, compared to today's modest 21%, creating conditions that would have made a simple campfire look like a potential apocalyptic event. This oxygen bonanza explains one of the period's most terrifying features: gigantic insects. Imagine dragonflies with 2-foot wingspans patrolling the skies and millipedes longer than your arm crawling through the underbrush. This wasn't just entomology, it was entomology with megalomania. The Carboniferous Permian transition that Limnocoelus witnessed represented one of Earth's major climate pivots. As Pangaea fully assembled and continental interiors became more isolated from oceanic influences, the planet began shifting from the warm, humid Carboniferous to the progressively drier Permian. It was like watching Earth slowly turn the dial from tropical paradise to challenging terrestrial obstacle course, precisely the kind of environmental pressure that would favor animals with adaptations for land living. This transitional period wasn't just changing Earth's thermostat, it was rewriting the rules of evolutionary success. The stable, widespread swamp environments that had dominated for millions of years were gradually retreating, creating a premium on adaptations that allowed independence from standing water. For creatures like Limnocelis, straddling the amphibian-reptile divide, these changes represented both challenge and opportunity. The Carboniferous Permian world lacked many of the ecological relationships we take for granted today. There were no flowering plants offering fruits as easy energy packages, no grasses providing vast grazing opportunities, no butterflies, bees, or pollinators creating complex plant-animal partnerships. The food web was simpler, but no less competitive, with primary production coming mainly from spore-producing plants that created different nutritional challenges for herbivores. This was the stage upon which Limnocelis performed its evolutionary role, a world of oxygen-rich air, coal-forming swamps, giant arthropods, and increasing environmental pressures that would ultimately separate the truly terrestrial from those still bound to water. It wasn't just a different time. It was practically a different planet, operating under rules and conditions that would seem alien to modern organisms. For Limnocelis, however, it was simply home the proving ground where the great terrestrial experiment was being conducted, one evolutionary innovation at a time. If Limnocelis had a LinkedIn profile, its headline would read, "Versatile Transitional Form, specializing in both aquatic and terrestrial environments, pioneering amniote innovation." Not exactly catchy, but certainly accurate. This creature was the ultimate portfolio worker of the Carboniferous, never fully committing to either the aquatic or terrestrial gig economy. Biomechanically speaking, Limnocelis moved with what paleontologists might generously call functional competence. On land, it likely employed a combination of sprawling and semi-erect posture, not the belly-dragging shuffle of salamanders, but not quite the upright stance of later reptiles either. Picture someone trying to do push-ups after leg day at the gym. Technically mobile, but nobody's making inspirational posters about it. In water, Limnocelis probably reverted to more familiar amphibian locomotion, using lateral undulations of its body and tail to propel itself while its limbs served as stabilizers. This dual-mode transportation system made it the prehistoric equivalent of an amphibious vehicle, not particularly elegant in either environment, but crucially able to exploit both. The feeding behavior of Limnocelis reflects the "why specialize when you can generalize" approach that characterized its entire evolutionary position. With its uniform conical teeth and powerful jaw muscles, it was equipped for an omnivorous diet that likely included invertebrates, small vertebrates, and possibly tough plant material. This was the Carboniferous version of "I'll eat whatever's on the buffet," a dietary flexibility that served as excellent insurance in a changing world. What truly distinguished Limnocelis behaviorally from its more amphibian contemporaries was its potential for extended terrestrial activity. While most amphibians needed to return to water regularly to prevent desiccation, our transitional hero had evolved skin with reduced permeability and possibly the beginnings of keratinized scales. This wasn't full reptilian water conservation yet, but it was like upgrading from a leaky bucket to one with just a few small holes. Significant progress in the water retention department. Reproduction represents another fascinating behavioral frontier for Limnocelis. Standing at the crossroads between amphibians, which typically lay eggs in water, and amniotes, which produce eggs with protective membranes, Limnocelis may have been experimenting with more terrestrial reproduction. While not fully liberated from moist environments for egg laying, it might have been depositing eggs in damp soil or rotting vegetation rather than directly in water, the evolutionary equivalent of dipping one's toe into terrestrial reproduction without fully committing. The sensory world of Limnocoelus likely combined elements from both its ancestral aquatic heritage and its emerging terrestrial adaptations. Its large skull housed well-developed eyes positioned for better terrestrial vision, while maintaining lateral line sensors for detecting water movements, essentially running both operating systems simultaneously, while evolution decided which would become dominant. Daily life for Limnocoelus probably involved a combination of opportunistic hunting, exploration of both aquatic and terrestrial environments, thermoregulation through behavioral means, moving between sun and shade, and vigilant monitoring for larger predators. Without specialized defensive adaptations, avoidance was likely its primary survival strategy. The social life of Limnocoelus remains speculative but was probably minimal by modern standards. There's little evidence suggesting complex social structures, though seasonal aggregations for reproduction can't be ruled out. These weren't creatures forming prehistoric book clubs or planning group hunts. They were solitary entrepreneurs in the business of survival. What makes Limnocoelus behaviorally significant isn't that it did anything particularly impressively, but rather that it did everything adequately. It wasn't specialized for running, swimming, hunting, or herbivory. Instead, it maintained a generalist approach that allowed it to survive in multiple environments and exploit diverse resources. This evolutionary hedging of bets proved remarkably prescient as environments changed through the Permian. In the behavioral evolution of vertebrates, Limnocoelus represents that crucial experimental phase where nature was actively testing which adaptations worked for terrestrial living, keeping the successful ones and discarding the rest. It wasn't just living its life, it was unwittingly participating in one of evolution's most important R&D projects, the conquest of land. In the Carboniferous Permian transitional world, Limnocoelus found itself in the uncomfortable middle position of the food chain, not quite apex predator material, but not exactly bottom feeder either. It was the prehistoric equivalent of middle management, dangerous to those below, vulnerable to those above, and constantly looking over its shoulder. The true nightmare fuel of this period came in the form of Dimetrodon, that sail-backed poster child of pre-dinosaur predators that your second-grade teacher probably incorrectly called a dinosaur. Reaching lengths of up to 4.6 meters, Dimetrodon was the Carboniferous equivalent of a freight train with teeth, a pelycosaur predator that could turn Limnocoelus from potential predator to actual prey in the span of one unfortunate encounter. With a skull packed with differentiated teeth, including prominent canines, an innovation Limnocoelus hadn't gotten around to evolving, Dimetrodon was the living embodiment of eat or be eaten, taken to its logical extreme. Equally concerning were the emerging therapsids, advanced synapsids, that would eventually give rise to mammals, but were at this point mostly interested in eating anything smaller than themselves. These creatures were beginning to develop more efficient metabolisms and improved locomotion, making them the Carboniferous equivalent of upgrading from dial-up to broadband in the predatory marketplace. Even the skies held threats for our transitional hero. Giant dragonfly relatives like Meganeura, with wingspans reaching 65 centimeters, weren't just impressively large insects. They were active predators, potentially capable of snatching smaller vertebrates. Imagine modern dragonflies, but sized up to nope, absolutely not proportions, and you'll understand why Limnocoelus might have thought twice about basking in open areas. Water, traditionally a refuge for amphibians, offered no guaranteed safety either. The Carboniferous Permian waterways hosted a variety of predatory temnospondyl amphibians, some reaching crocodilian proportions with similar dining preferences. These included Ariops, a 2-meter amphibian with a skull full of sharp teeth and disappointingly few moral qualms about cannibalism. When your supposed amphibian cousins view you less as family and more as fast food, aquatic retreats become considerably less appealing. Perhaps most insidious were the environmental threats creeping in during this period. As the Permian progressed, the stable coal swamps that had characterized the Carboniferous began retreating as the climate dried. For a creature not fully committed to terrestrial living, this environmental shift represented an existential challenge, the evolutionary equivalent of having your lease terminated while still shopping for furniture for your new place. Even the very air Limnocelis breathed presented an unusual hazard. The hyperoxic atmosphere, up to 35% oxygen, that enabled gigantism in insects also created conditions where wildfires could spread with unprecedented ferocity and intensity. A lightning strike could transform vast tracts of coal forest into apocalyptic infernos that spread faster and burned hotter than anything in the modern world, the ultimate nowhere-to-run scenario for terrestrial vertebrates. Competition came not just from obvious predators, but also from ecological contemporaries exploiting similar niches. Other reptiliomorphs and early amniotes were working through the same evolutionary challenges, often with slightly different approaches. Some were becoming more specialized for particular diets or habitats, potentially outcompeting generalists like Limnocelis in specific ecological contexts. The most existential threat, however, was evolutionary rather than ecological. Limnocelis existed at a transition point where nature was actively selecting which adaptations would proceed into the amniote future and which would be discarded as evolutionary dead ends. Its generalist approach, while providing short-term flexibility, risked being outcompeted by more specialized forms as environments changed and ecological niches became more defined. In this transitional world, Limnocelis navigated a landscape where danger came from above, below, and within its changing environment. It wasn't simply avoiding being eaten. It was participating in a high-stakes evolutionary experiment where failure meant not just individual death but lineage extinction. The fact that its anatomical innovations contributed to the amniote blueprint that would eventually conquer the planet suggests that, despite these multifaceted threats, Limnocelis and its kind were doing something fundamentally right in their approach to the challenges of terrestrial living. If there were a misunderstood prehistoric creature support group, Limnocelis would be a founding member, right alongside Dimetrodon, not a dinosaur, Pteranodon, also not a dinosaur, and every other creature that elementary school books have mislabeled for decades. The public perception of Limnocelis, when it exists at all, is a fascinating case study in how we project our understanding of modern animals onto creatures that lived in fundamentally different worlds. First, let's address the biggest misconception. Limnocelis was not a reptile in the strict modern sense. Despite often being portrayed as a primitive reptile in older literature and museum displays, it's more accurately classified as a reptiliomorph amphibian, or an early amniote, essentially evolution's draft version, before publishing the final reptile manuscript. This taxonomic nuance matters because it highlights the actual fascinating story, not what Limnocelis was, but what it was becoming. In popular culture, Limnocelis is the definition of obscurity, while T. Rex gets blockbuster movies, and velociraptors get scientifically inaccurate portrayals in franchises worth billions. Poor Limnocelis barely rates a mention in most dinosaur books, which is doubly ironic since it's not a dinosaur and predates them by roughly 100 million years. It's the evolutionary equivalent of being the brilliant but forgotten grandparent of a celebrity family. Paleontological understanding of Limnocelis has undergone significant revision over the decades. When first described in 1911 by Samuel Wendell Williston, a name that itself sounds like it belongs in a period drama, it was considered a cotylosaur, or stem reptile. Since then, it's been reclassified multiple times as our understanding of early tetrapod evolution has improved. This taxonomic musical chairs reflects the genuine difficulty in classifying transitional forms creatures, that by definition don't fit neatly into the categories we create. The discovery history of Limnocelis contains its own fascinating story. The first specimens were found in New Mexico in what's known as the Cutler Formation, dating to the early Permian. Later discoveries expanded our understanding of its range and anatomical details. Each new fossil find has refined our picture of this transitional creature, though complete specimens remain relatively rare, contributing to its continued obscurity compared to more abundantly preserved later animals. In museum displays, Limnocelis often suffers from what might be called transitional form syndrome, either being overlooked entirely or presented as merely a stepping stone to more impressive later creatures. Few exhibits celebrate it for what it actually represents, a successful animal in its own right that happened to possess features that would become evolutionarily significant. It's the fossil equivalent of being remembered only as the famous person's great-grandparent, rather than as an individual with their own accomplishments. Scientifically, one of the most interesting aspects of Limnocelis is how it illuminates the non-linear nature of evolution. Rather than representing a simple halfway point between amphibians and reptiles, it shows how evolution produces mosaic organisms with combinations of primitive and derived features. Some aspects of Limnocelis were surprisingly advanced, while others retained ancestral conditions, a reminder that evolution doesn't follow a straight line, but rather explores multiple possibilities simultaneously. In paleontological education, Limnocelis serves as an excellent teaching example of how major transitions in vertebrate evolution occurred not as sudden leaps, but as accumulations of incremental changes. The amphibian to amniote transition it helps illustrate was one of the most significant in vertebrate history, enabling the full exploitation of terrestrial environments and setting the stage for the later radiation of reptiles, dinosaurs, birds, and mammals. Perhaps the greatest irony regarding Limnocelis is that while it remains obscure to the public, paleontologists recognize it as representing one of the most important transitions in vertebrate evolution. The move from amphibians to amniotes wasn't just another step in the evolutionary parade. It was a fundamental reorganization of vertebrate biology that enabled the conquest of land far from permanent water sources. Without this transition, the entire subsequent history of terrestrial vertebrates would have been impossible. So while Limnocelis may never achieve the popular recognition of later, more specialized reptiles and dinosaurs, its evolutionary significance far outweighs its cultural footprint. Sometimes the most important characters in life's story are the ones working quietly in the background, setting the stage for everything that follows. As our journey with Limnocelis comes to an end, we're left contemplating an organism that never knew its place in Earth's grand narrative. It couldn't have comprehended that its modest anatomical innovations, stronger limbs, watertight skull, improved vertebral structure would eventually enable everything from Tyrannosaurus rex to eagles to humans. Limnocelis wasn't trying to change the world. It was just trying to survive one Permian day at a time. And therein lies the profound poetry of evolution. The most revolutionary changes often come not from dramatic leaps, but from small, incremental adaptations accumulating over millions of years. Limnocelis didn't wake up one morning and decide to pioneer terrestrial living. It simply possessed variations that proved slightly advantageous in its changing world, variations that would be built upon and refined by countless generations that followed. If Limnocelis could somehow observe the modern world seeing birds soaring through the sky, crocodiles patrolling waterways, and humans reshaping the entire planet, would it recognize its own legacy? Would it see in the amniotic egg of a sparrow or the scales of a lizard the distant echoes of its own evolutionary innovations? Probably not. Evolution doesn't work with foresight or intention, just endless trial and error across deep time. The story of Limnocelis isn't just about a specific ancient creature. It's about evolutionary transitions themselves, those critical junctures where life pivots in new directions. The amphibian to amniote transition it represents is among the most significant in vertebrate history, comparable to the evolution of flight, the emergence of mammals, or the development of human intelligence. These transitions are where evolution's creativity truly shines. Perhaps the most humbling aspect of studying creatures like Limnocelis is the perspective it provides on our own place in Earth's history. Modern humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years, a mere geological eye blink compared to the 300 million years since Limnocelis lived. Yet we often act as if our moment on Earth is the culmination of all evolutionary history, the final and most important chapter in life's story. Limnocelis reminds us otherwise. It was neither the beginning nor the end of evolutionary innovation, just one chapter in an ongoing narrative that began billions of years before us and will likely continue billions of years after us. The terrestrial vertebrate revolution it helped pioneer wasn't working toward producing humans. It was simply exploring adaptive possibilities, one of which eventually led to us. If there's a lesson to be taken from our humble reptiliomorph friend, perhaps it's this: significance doesn't require recognition. Limnocelis changed the course of evolutionary history without awards, without fame, without even knowing what it was accomplishing. Its legacy lives on not in public acclaim, but in the fundamental biology of every amniot alive today, including the humans now studying its fossilized remains. The next time you see a bird building a nest, a turtle basking on a log, or a lizard scurrying across hot sand far from water, spare a thought for Limnocelis and its contemporaries. These modern creatures, perfectly adapted to terrestrial living, are the inheritors of innovations that began with unassuming transitional forms working out the challenges of land living 300 million years ago. Evolution continues its unending experiment, building upon what came before, occasionally discarding what no longer works, but always preserving the core innovations that prove successful. We are all, in this sense, living archives of evolutionary history, carrying within our biology the accumulated wisdom of countless ancestors, most of whom, like Limnocelis, have been forgotten by all but the most dedicated scientists. And perhaps that's the most fitting memorial for a transitional form like Limnocelis, not a museum display or a popular documentary, but the living, breathing testament of all terrestrial vertebrate life. Its true monument isn't carved in stone, but written in the genetic code of everything that walks, crawls, or flies across our planet's surface today. Not bad for a meter-long creature with an identity crisis and a face only a paleontologist could love. Imagine a world where walking outside your cave meant possibly becoming lunch for a saber-toothed cat with teeth so large they barely fit in its mouth. A world where mammoths stood 3 times taller than your SUV and ground sloths, yes, sloths were the size of elephants and probably just as cuddly. Welcome to Earth Pleistocene Edition, the original Super Size Me experiment, where nature decided that bigger was definitely better until it suddenly wasn't. Before you settle in for this journey through time, take a moment to hit that subscribe button faster than a dire wolf chasing down a giant beaver. Leave a comment below telling us which extinct megafauna you'd least want to encounter in a dark alley. Personally, I'd avoid the short-faced bear Imagine a grizzly, but angrier, hungrier, and on performance-enhancing drugs. What we're about to explore isn't just some dusty paleontological footnote. It's perhaps the greatest ecological murder mystery of all time. Between roughly 50,000 and 10,000 years ago, something or someone caused the systematic elimination of Earth's heavyweight champions. Over 150 genera of megafauna that science speak for really big animals disappeared forever from our planet. Was it climate change? Was it humans with their fancy new spears and collective hunting strategies? Was it an extraterrestrial hit job? Or perhaps, as with most true crime stories, it was a perfect storm of unfortunate events that sent these magnificent beasts into evolutionary retirement. Today, we're CSI, Pleistocene, and we're reopening the cold case that's been literally frozen for millennia. We'll examine the suspects, analyze the timeline, and ultimately reveal the consequences of this mass extinction event that fundamentally altered Earth's ecosystems forever. So grab your metaphorical time machine and your actual snacks. We're traveling back to when being an absolute unit wasn't just a meme, it was an evolutionary strategy. A strategy that, spoiler alert, didn't exactly stand the test of time. The Pleistocene epoch spanning from about 2.6 million to 11,700 years ago was essentially Earth's version of bipolar disorder. Picture the planet constantly swinging between frigid ice ages and brief, relatively cozy interglacial periods. We're talking mood swings that make your teenager's emotional roller coaster look like a gentle carousel ride. During this climatological temper tantrum, ice sheets could extend as far south as New York and London. Imagine the Statue of Liberty wearing a kilometer-thick ice cap instead of her usual Crown Lady Liberty's ultimate bad hair day. Sea levels dropped by up to 120 meters, which is like draining the equivalent of 48 Olympic swimming pools for every single human currently alive on Earth. These ice age cycles weren't just Earth playing around with its thermostat. They were driven by Milankovitch cycles, subtle changes in Earth's orbit and axial tilt that affect how much sunlight reaches different parts of the planet. Essentially, our relationship with the sun has always been complicated, and we're still working through those issues. One fascinating consequence of all this frozen water was the emergence of land bridges. The Bering Strait between Alaska and Russia? Gone. Replaced by a 1,000-kilometer-wide wildlife highway called Beringia. Britain wasn't an island, but a peninsula of Europe. Australia and Papua New Guinea were having a landmass merger. It was like continental musical chairs, and when the music stopped, or rather, when the ice melted, everyone had to scramble to new positions. But here's where it gets really interesting. Those places we now know as bone-dry deserts, the Sahara, the American Southwest, parts of Australia, during certain periods of the Pleistocene, they were positively lush. The Sahara alternated between desert and savanna with massive lakes. Las Vegas would have been lakefront property, and not just metaphorically when it comes to liquidating your assets. The Pleistocene wasn't just colder, it was different in almost every ecological way. Carbon dioxide levels hovered around 180-280 parts per million. For comparison, we're currently pushing past 420 ppm, which is like going from a gentle caffeine buzz to a triple espresso shot directly into Earth's atmosphere. This lower CO2 environment favored C4 plants grasses that could thrive in lower carbon dioxide conditions. The result? Vast grasslands and open woodlands replaced dense forests in many regions, creating the perfect buffet for large herbivores. And where you have walking all-you-can-eat salad bars, you inevitably get predators showing up for their own version of fine dining. The most distinctive Pleistocene environment was probably the mammoth steppe massive biome that stretched from Spain to Canada and from Arctic islands to China. This wasn't the tundra we know today, with its sparse vegetation and permafrost. It was a highly productive grassland ecosystem supporting an almost ridiculous density of large mammals. Imagine the Serengeti, but supersized and refrigerated. Herds of mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, bison, horses, and reindeer, all grazing on nutrient-rich grasses and herbs, all while trying not to become lunch for the equally impressive carnivores that stalked them. As we approach the end of the Pleistocene, around 20,000 years ago, Earth began warming out of the last glacial maximum. This wasn't a gentle transition, it was more like someone yanking the emergency brake on winter. In some places, temperatures rose by as much as 10 degrees Celsius in just decades. That's like going from Chicago in January to Miami in July without even packing a different wardrobe. These rapid shifts created a perfect storm of environmental stressors. Habitats transformed, migrations were disrupted, and food webs began to unravel. And into this already chaotic situation strode a particularly innovative ape with opposable thumbs and a concerning penchant for pointy sticks. But we'll get to that particular plot twist shortly. Being big in the Pleistocene came with certain advantages, like not having to worry about most predators. Most, but not all. Because evolution, in its infinite wisdom, had created an arms race of epic proportions. For every massive herbivore peacefully munching on primeval salad, there existed a carnivore specialized in turning that herbivore into an all-you-can-eat buffet. Take Smilodon, the saber-toothed cat. Basically, your house cat's evolutionary cousin who decided that normal-sized canines were for underachievers. Its upper canines could reach up to 28 centimeters long. That's not a tooth, that's a dagger with a pulse. These weren't for show either. They were precision instruments designed to deliver a fatal bite to the neck or belly of large prey. If sabers weren't your style, perhaps the American lion would interest you, 30% larger than modern African lions, and about as cuddly as a chainsaw. These massive cats weren't interested in your antelope-sized critters. No, they were specialized to take down juvenile mammoths and ground sloths. Imagine a predator that looks at a baby elephant and thinks, yes, that's a reasonable lunch. But perhaps the most terrifying predator of North America wasn't even a cat. Arctodus simus, the short-faced bear, stood 3.5 meters tall on its hind legs. That's taller than a basketball hoop. Unlike modern bears with their omnivorous tendencies and occasional vegetarian phases, this monster was hyper-carnivorous. And despite weighing up to a ton, it could run at speeds of 50-60 km/h. For reference, Usain Bolt tops out at about 45 km/h. Yes, the fastest human in history would have made a lovely appetizer for this ursine nightmare. Game of Thrones fans, rejoice! Dire wolves were absolutely real, though considerably less interested in dynastic politics and more focused on hunting in highly coordinated packs. Stronger jaws, more robust builds, and less patience than their modern gray wolf descendants. These predators specialized in bringing down bison, horses, and even young mastodons. But the most dangerous predator of the late Pleistocene didn't have massive teeth, overwhelming strength, or exceptional speed. What it did have was something far more lethal, the ability to throw pointy sticks with alarming accuracy and the novel concept of planning ahead. Homo sapiens. That's us. In case you've forgotten, your taxonomy entered the megafaunal playground relatively late, but made up for lost time with enthusiasm. Our ancestors were the original disruption technology, combining tools, fire, language, and cooperative hunting to punch well above their weight class. Yet predators, human or otherwise, weren't the only dangers lurking in the Pleistocene. Climate change. The original, non-anthropogenic version presented a more subtle but equally deadly threat. Imagine adapting perfectly to an environment that then fundamentally changes every few thousand years. It's like mastering the rules of chess only to have someone suddenly declare you're now playing Monopoly, except the penalty for losing isn't bankruptcy, it's extinction. As the ice sheets began their final retreat around 15,000 years ago, habitats fragmented. Migration routes that had existed for millennia vanished. Land bridges disappeared beneath rising seas. Resources became unpredictable. For species already specialized for specific environmental conditions, these changes were catastrophic. And let's not forget everyone's favorite topic since 2020, pandemics. Some scientists have proposed that novel diseases may have contributed to megafaunal extinctions. As humans and their domesticated animals spread across continents, they potentially introduced pathogens that native wildlife had no immunity against. It's like prehistoric biological warfare, but with more accidental genocide and less deliberate malice. The perfect storm of threats, predation pressure, climate volatility, habitat fragmentation, novel diseases, and resource competition created what ecologists call extinction vortices. Once populations dropped below certain thresholds, genetic diversity declined, making adaptation increasingly difficult, creating a downward spiral from which many species simply couldn't recover. For the megafauna of the Pleistocene, it wasn't just one horseman of the apocalypse they faced, it was the entire cavalry, charging at them from all directions at once. Let's talk about the stars of our Pleistocene drama, the megafauna themselves. These weren't just big animals. They were evolutionary masterpieces, biomechanical marvels that pushed the boundaries of what terrestrial life could accomplish. The woolly mammoth Mammuthus primigenius was essentially an elephant that decided to go full Canadian winter fashion, standing up to 3.5 meters tall, at the shoulder smaller than today's African elephants, but with a seriously upgraded wardrobe. These iconic Ice Age celebrities sported a triple-layered insulation system that would make modern outdoor gear manufacturers weep with envy. First came a dense undercoat of fine wool, then a thicker layer of curly hair, topped with outer guard hairs that could reach a meter in length. Imagine wearing 3 winter coats at once, except you can't take them off when you enter a building. Their ears and tails were drastically reduced to prevent heat loss evolution's version of let's skip the convertible and go with the coupe. Those magnificent curved tusks weren't just for show, either. They served as multi-tools for digging through snow to reach vegetation, fighting off predators, and impressing potential mates, the Pleistocene equivalent of a Swiss Army knife, gym membership, and dating profile all wrapped into one impressive package of dental enamel. If mammoths were the tanks of the Pleistocene, then Megatherium, the giant ground sloth, was its mobile siege tower. Picture a sloth the size of an elephant, capable of standing on its hind legs to reach heights of up to 6 meters. That's tall enough to peer into a second-story window, should prehistoric neighborhoods have existed. These weren't your modern sloths that move so slowly that algae grows on them. No, these were robust powerhouses with forearms like hydraulic excavators and claws that would make Freddy Krueger reconsider his career choices. Those massive claws, up to 20 centimeters long, weren't primarily weapons, but rather specialized tools for pulling down branches and digging up roots. Think Edward Scissorhands, but with a strictly vegetarian diet and considerably more body mass. Castoroids, the giant beaver, proves that even rodents got in on the Pleistocene supersizing trend. At 2.2 meters long and weighing up to 100 kilograms, it was essentially a beaver that had been hitting the gym. Unlike its modern dam-building cousin, though, there's no evidence that giant beavers constructed anything. They were apparently the family disappointments of the beaver evolutionary tree, blessed with size but lacking the architectural ambition. Bison latifrons. The long-horned bison makes modern bison look like they've been significantly downsized for suburban living. Standing 2.5 meters tall at the shoulder with horn spans reaching up to 2.5 meters tip to tip, these behemoths were the heavyweight champions of the bovine world. For comparison, that horn span is wider than a king-sized bed, truly the Texas of all bison species. If you're a fan of armadillos, prepare to have your mind blown by Glyptodon, a South American tank that took the concept of personal protection to unprecedented levels. Picture an armadillo the size of a Volkswagen Beetle covered in a solid dome of armor made from fused bony plates. Unlike its modern descendant, Glyptodon couldn't roll into a ball. It was more like a living bunker with an attitude problem. On the carnivore side, we've already mentioned Arctodus, the short-faced bear, but its terrifying credentials bear repeating. This wasn't just a larger version of a grizzly, it was a fundamentally different evolutionary experiment. Its unusually long legs gave it a running stance more similar to a wolf than a modern bear. Combined with its massive size and presumed hypercarnivorous diet, this was essentially nature's attempt to create the perfect land predator. The elephant family tree during the Pleistocene wasn't just the African and Asian elephants we know today. It was a diverse dynasty that included not just mammoths, but also mastodons, gomphotheres, and straight-tusked elephants, each adapted to different ecological niches across virtually every continent, except Antarctica and Australia. It was like nature created various specialized models of the same basic design, each optimized for different terrain and climate conditions. What made these creatures truly remarkable wasn't just their size, it was their ecological impact. Each megafaunal species was an ecosystem engineer, reshaping landscapes through their feeding, movement, and other behaviors. Mammoths maintained grasslands by knocking down trees. Giant herbivores dispersed massive seeds that smaller animals couldn't swallow. Predators kept herbivore populations in check, preventing overgrazing. They weren't just inhabitants of their ecosystems. They were the architects and maintenance crew all in one, and their disappearance would leave ecological vacancies that, in many cases, remain unfilled to this day. So what happens when you remove the largest pieces from Earth's ecological puzzle? The answer, it turns out, is far more profound than most of us realize. The disappearance of megafauna wasn't just a sad ending for some impressively large animals. It was a fundamental rewiring of how our planet's ecosystems function. When the mega-herbivores vanished, so did their capacity to disperse large seeds across vast distances. Plants that had co-evolved with these living distribution systems suddenly found themselves stranded without their evolutionary partners. Avocados, papayas, and numerous large-fruited trees survived only because humans decided they were tasty enough to cultivate. Without our agricultural intervention, they would have followed their animal partners into evolutionary oblivion. The vast grasslands maintained by browsing and grazing megafauna began their slow transformation into closed canopy forests, or in drier regions, deserts. The mammoth steppe, that incredibly productive ecosystem that once covered vast swaths of the northern hemisphere, essentially vanished, replaced by less productive tundra and boreal forest. It's as if someone fired the landscape's maintenance crew and never hired replacements. The consequences continue to ripple through time. Modern wildfires, intensified by the buildup of plant material that would have been consumed by mega-herbivores. Declining soil fertility, partially due to the loss of megafaunal nutrient distribution through their massive quantities of dung. Even climate change has a megafaunal connection. Fewer methane-producing herbivores may have contributed to the cooler temperatures that helped trigger the Little Ice Age. And perhaps most sobering of all, we're still doing it. The remaining megafauna elephants, rhinos, giraffes, great apes, big cats, are all facing the same threats that eliminated their Pleistocene counterparts. It's like watching the same tragic movie play out again, except this time we're fully aware of the ending and still not changing the script. Some visionary ecologists have proposed rewilding projects, reintroducing surviving megafauna to their former ranges, or even using modern relatives as ecological proxies for extinct species. Others dream of de-extinction through genetic engineering, but the simplest solution might just be to stop the ongoing sequel to the Pleistocene extinction before we complete what our ancestors started. The disappearance of the Pleistocene giants wasn't just prehistoric history, it was the beginning of a human-dominated world, the first major step toward the Anthropocene. In losing these magnificent creatures, we didn't just lose spectacular animals, we lost the wild heart of our planet. And that might be the greatest tragedy of all. For now, these giants live only in our museums and imaginations. The question is, what will we tell future generations when they ask why we let the last of Earth's giants disappear on our watch?